Hello, everyone. This is Dora Smith, and you're listening to Engineering the Future Workforce by Siemens. On this podcast, we explore emerging and best practices that are empowering the next generation of talent. The series showcases conversations with leading voices from academia and industry who are committed to improving learners' digital skill set and mindset to accelerate innovation. Subscribe wherever you do podcasts. Hello, everyone. In this episode of Engineering the Future Workforce, we explore how stackable microcredentials and learning and employment records are redefining how people learn, work, and evolve throughout their careers. As the pace of innovation accelerates, lifelong learning is no longer optional. It's essential. So our guest, Octavio Heredia, serves as Director of Global Outreach and Extended Education at Arizona State University's Fulton Schools of Engineering, where he leads initiatives that connect industry, academia, and learners across the world. With a focus on high-demand fields like microelectronics and AI, Octavio has been at the forefront of designing scalable, industry-aligned pathways that empower learners to build careers through flexible, verified learning experience. Hello, Octavio. How are you?
I'm doing great, Dora. Great to see you again.
Yes, great.
Thank
to
you
see
so much for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Well, looking forward to the conversation. Your work at ASU's Fulton School of Engineering, it reflects a powerful vision for democratized access to, world-class education and really building bridges between learning and work. I'd like to hear a little bit about what first inspired your focus on, lifelong learning and global partnerships as the vehicles for innovation in engineering education.
Oh, that's a great question, right? So I've been at ASU I think it'll be almost 23 years now. And when I first kind of took the role, I had moved to Phoenix and kind of getting to know the city and everything. And I sort of saw it as a sort of maybe even a temporary role in a way, right? And I don't think any of us really kind of knew the they are, the type of organization, the type of change that President Crow was really going to drive forward within the institution and really the rocket ship that we were all jumping on board. And it's really been an amazing, right, to kind of see, how our college or schools of engineering and really has been, just the field of engineering education has changed and transformed and the really front row seat that we've had the opportunity to be at and in driving some of that change, facilitating and convening, stakeholders to drive that change. And so, it's really been an amazing journey, right? A very rewarding journey, right? Getting to work with our amazing faculty, our amazing staff, really getting to hear a lot about the impact of our, or work does on, professional mobility, socioeconomic mobility aspects of it. And they just have, the opportunity to play a little bit of a role in you know, planting those seeds, it's been amazing, right? And so I think for us now, the micro credentials, the verified credentials, the space, right, that really brings a new area of innovation, right? And other aspects that we'll talk a little bit about what does that mean on a day-to-day basis. But, I think we're really excited about, the access, right? How do we provide access and meet the learners where they are? How do we provide access to all this knowledge and expertise that resides within our faculty? And so, I think it's an area that we're really excited at, just for the opportunity that it can present. Obviously, a lot of work involved, amongst all of us, right? Industry, government, academia. But, I think those are the types of challenges that, we at ASU really like and really, trying to find a way of playing a role and that we can how, move those challenges and then move on those opportunities, right? So.
I like that you said access because I was going back through the archives. Octavio, I think you and I met about 13 years ago at one of our user group events. And then one of your comments, I think we were talking about what was new and happening, was just how fascinating and interesting things were given all the new compute power then, right? And that was long before AI and certainly long before the world of micro credentials as we know it now. Um, so you've had a long history at ASU, and I know we've known each other a long time, but it's really just been in the last 2 years that you and I got kind of reengaged on this whole topic of micro-credentials. I've been asked recently, like, why are we leaning into micro-credentials now? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I think, for us, it's sort of that sense of, you know, the innovation piece of it, right? Obviously, the change, the needs of industry continue to change. The needs of our learners and where they are, right? Continue to change. How do we engage with different types of learners, right? Through that change and that ASU has that transformation that ASU has been going through. We've been able to then find ways of engaging with more learners in different circumstances and different situations. And so, I think when you kind of combine all of that, right, and we're, finding a new ways of how we can, provide engineering technology education to those that are ready for it. This sort of serves as another mechanism, right? Another type of structure where we can, think about, a more agile way of meeting the needs of industry, of learners, right? So I think that's kind of why we are, right? We're early, I want to say, right? We're still in a learning journey. But again, I think that opportunity for innovation and really better serving the needs of our learners and our partners, right? I think it really kind of makes it a big reason for we're leaning in, right? And want to be an active contributors, why we want to be an active part of the conversation, not just in the sidelines. And so, I think when you take all of those things, that's what we're investing, our time. We're learning, we're attending events, we're contributing back to the dialogue. But I think ultimately that's the reason why we're leaning in.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about how you guys are actively, contributing. This demand for micro credentials and short form learning, it's really been reshaping how education meets industry needs. And so I wanted maybe you could share a little bit about how is ASU leveraging, really the whole concept of stackable micro credentials that can create that flexible, personalized learning journey for students and working professionals.
Yeah, so I'll preface that by saying that we're early, right? We are still trying to kind of figure out, right, sort of a lot of the different aspects of it, right? So we're not quite, we're learning from others, right? I would consider there's a lot of other institutions and colleagues that are really farther along the journey, and so we sort of always appreciate the opportunities to learn from them and connect with them. But I think for us, we have an amazing amount of knowledge and expertise that resides within our faculty and our staff here, right? We have an amazing number of both, digital and physical assets some of them which are not unique to ASU, right? That are shared amongst academia, but some of them that are, unique to ASU. And so how do we take sort of that responsibility when we have, all of these assets, and how can we use them to better improve the societies where we work, right? Better work with the communities where we want to serve. And so, I think the stackable credentials give us another opportunity to just be, a framework to be more agile, right? To be able to move faster, to better understand the needs of learners and partners, and really be able to move faster, highly focused on those specific needs, right? And really kind of provide a mechanism to meet the learner where they are at the point of where they need that particular learning experience, right? Obviously, we're complementing, right, our courses, the degrees, the certificates, right, all the traditional credentials that a university is known for. But it kind of gives us another mechanism to really augment, those traditional learning experiences with new types of learning experiences, right? Different learning experiences that can be, used in very, specific situations, right? Again, to help advance a learner, acquire new skills, new knowledge, and really augment, everything else that they've acquired through their traditional degree programs.
So with that, thinking about them being highly focused, a little more personalized, is there an example, Octavio, you can share of how, a learner or maybe a partner organization you work with really benefited from stackable credentials? And I guess I'd be most interested if you're seeing that in some of, fields like AI or semiconductor.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have a few, right? Both, at the individual level, working with organizations and partners, right? But I think one that I can really kind of talk about it's, most recently we worked with a global semiconductor company, have a presence all around the world. They're a design and manufacturing company. And they really wanted to upskill their engineering talent in semiconductor device physics and some engineering topics associated with that. And it was really an initiative that was highly focused on some business outcomes that the organization and this particular group had. And so we used the micro credential framework to really kind of give us, the design and development kind of process and be able to validate, right, kind of those training outcomes, that training program validated with, their experts to make sure that we were, meeting their need and it's structured in a way that sort of worked for the learners themselves, right? And, really we were able to find, relevant content and expertise from, different different courses, different academic courses, be able to pull them out, organize them into the new structure and quickly deliver, you know, that particular content, right? And so highly focused on the skill and competencies that the partner wanted to achieve, right? In a way that it was assessed, both on the design, but as well afterwards, right? To make sure that we met the outcome, and the micro credential just kind of really gave us a way to also, incentivize learners as they were going from each micro credential to another micro credential, right? I think a lot of times, we've built this kind of long, extensive training programs and you don't may not necessarily always get that reward until, at the end of the program, right? But then how do we kind of motivate and incentivize and reward learners as they're going through this learning experiences? And so by using our micro credential framework really kind of allow us to achieve, that motivation and retention component that we're able to sort of understand what they were learning, apply it back into their jobs. And, we trained, about 60 engineers from 3 different global sites, right? And so, so it was really kind of and like say, right, we've done this kind of short courses and type of training programs before, right? So, we might ask, well, what was the different about it, right? And I think for us, what was different about it was using our micro credential framework to really tackle that highly focus on the learning outcomes, highly focus on the skills and competencies that the client wanted. Really look at the end, right, as how we were improving those business outcomes, while also improving the knowledge and expertise for the individual engineers. And so, I think it just kind of gave us a framework to really be able to navigate that whole process quickly, very agile, working very closely with our partners in that regard. And so, I think that's something that's, we've sort of have replicated that model a number of times, right? We're also now working on some micro credentials, where we're, really looking at upskilling some, local manufacturing talent, right? That's become a significant need here in Arizona. And so, I think it's really being able to provide knowledge and new skills to a talent, in a short amount of time that can really have a quick positive impact on their jobs, on their job prospects, right? If they're looking for any opportunity. And so, I think those are some ways of how in this early journey that we're seeing those positive results and, kind of energizes the team to really keep going forward, right? And
Yeah.
keep working through some of the challenges that we're seeing, but it's that really personal reward that we all sort of align with when you're working in academia.
So you just spoke really to the agility, right? That was really required and, how to kind of validate along the way. So I'm kind of curious, how do you balance that, quality assurance you want, and maybe the framework helps address a lot of this, but how do you really balance that quality assurance with really wanting, scalability and to reach as many learners as you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think scalability is part of ASU's DNA at this point, right? So I think scalability is something that we just naturally think about, right? We again, and scalability for a whole lot of different reasons, right? But really the primary ones, it's the access, right? How can we provide access to new knowledge, to new experiences, to learners around the world, right? So scalability, it's naturally right part of how we think about things, right? And then it being part of the schools of engineering, right? I think where most of our programs are ABIT accredited, has really built the foundation for how we think about quality insurance and the value that it has, right? In engineering and education, having a strong process, right, of how we think about quality. And so that really gave us a strong foundation to build on, right? I think, within our faculty, within our staff, these were areas that are, familiar with. And so really for us, as we were thinking on the micro credentials, it's now build the processes, right? To really, look at, what are the knowledge and skills that are relevant to industry, that are needed by industry. How do we validate them, through different feedback loops and through different, mechanisms that we built in. And, really how do we assess, the assessment, that practice within the micro credential itself, right? Because one of the things that we sort of want to convey to employers, we want to convey to learners, that if you have a micro credential from ASU, right, that you have demonstrated, the acquisition of a particular skill, that it's not just, just new knowledge, but it's new knowledge put into practice. And so, we really had to look at that, the assessment approach, and then our assessment of the whole micro credential itself, right? And so, so I think that was sort of kind of the challenge that we had, right? So how do we look at those new processes? What can we learn from more academic, and course experiences, and bring it into kind of this new area? Not losing that agility component, not losing that aspect of innovation, right? To really kind of box us in, but really try to think about it a little bit different. And so, we're still working through it, right? But I think that's the goal, right? How do we think about scale? How do we, convey, quality and rigor, and demonstration of skills, right? And because I think our learners, our employers are still learning that, right? You talked a little bit about, the conversations we had 13 years ago. And, I think that's still, part of the work that we're doing today, right? Educating our learners, educating our employers, educating, our stakeholders on the value of what does it mean to have a micro credential from ASU.
I like how you said, really defining it as new knowledge put into practice. Um, I wonder if you have any tips, Octavio, because there's times when I'll talk to customers of ours or and executives, and they're usually in one of two camps, right? They really either get micro credentials and are all in, or they're just trying to understand what is this thing and how is it different from credentials we knew in the past, or full degrees. Any analogies, I guess, or tips when you're trying to explain it, to either a learner, or a company that you think resonates well?
I think that's definitely one that we're kind of learning from a numbers, right? I think we attended a recent event in, focus in alternative credentials, new credentials, right? And I think I think that's the part that a lot of us are trying to figure out, right? Like what's working well, what's the messaging, what's the vocabulary, right? What's the
And
terminology that we can best use. And so, I think for us, it's when we work with employers, right? I think a lot of them, it's trying that we're conveying the quality, the rigor, the expertise that, ASU is known for. And a lot of them already know or have some familiarity with ASU in that regard. And so, in a mechanism that allows us to meet a different need for a different type of learner, right? So I think
yeah.
with employers, or I think we try to kind of think a little bit more about from a talent development component, which is something that they're familiar with, right? We talk a little bit about building talent pipelines, right? And being able to scale those talent pipelines, right? As, their needs change over time. So those are some ways of how we try to compare with employers. With learners, right? I think a lot of it's, again, we're working with different types of learners. And so sort of understanding where they are and where they want to go next helps in that regard, right? I think with some of our, undergraduate students, right? I think, they understand that, just your degree alone, it's not enough to really stand out to an employer themselves, right? And so, and they're familiar with, co-curricular, extracurricular activities, study abroad, internships, all of these mechanisms that, we in academia with the help of our industry partners facilitate for students. But, you know, this becomes another tool in that toolbox, right? How do
Yeah.
you, how do you augment that degree program, right? Beyond, your elective courses, beyond your research experiences, beyond your internship, how do you augment that new knowledge, right? In those areas where maybe, you don't have the time for a whole new course in, if you're electrical engineer and you want to learn more about chemical engineering and you run out all of your electives, well, here's a mechanism for how you can augment that degree and that experience. And so, so everything is really kind of looking at where they are and where they go, and then using, the stackable micro credentials as the mechanism to get from point A to point B, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, I love any insights, from
I like the
your
language
viewers,
piece. Yeah, maybe we're
you
we're
know.
just translators, right, of this new language.
Yeah, any insights we can learn from, you can find me online. I would welcome all that.
Um, well, let's talk a little bit about, partnerships. I think, strategic collaborations, we know they're critical, right, to bridging the skills gap, particularly as how fast evolving our industries are. And I think true collaboration, it's really an important part of building these credentials that have high quality and that we know are going to be impactful. Um, and I think it's a model, of what future learning looks like, right? It's hopefully the silos have been broken down and industry and academia are really working together. You guys are doing that in a number of ways. So can you share a little bit about, what you're learning from forging partnerships between yourselves and global industries and maybe even governments to, expand access to micro credentials and engineering education?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I can share, and it's definitely anybody that's working in that world, right, will already recognize, but they're hard, right? They are, it's hard, right, to really kind of find that alignment between, large, complex organizations, right? But when you're working, right, to really solve those big global challenges, right, that's the only way that it's gonna get done, right? And so, so I think we really, we've come to understand that, right? We're always open, to understand a problem, and potential solutions, and then who needs to be part of that solution aspect of it, right? To trying to bring as many perspectives as we can, different types of resources and strengths that, that academia, government, and industry can bring into it. And so, so I think we have, a number of, like successful efforts, right? Even just the transformation of how we're working here locally in Arizona, or if we were to look at how we're working around the world, right? It's really never on our own, right? It's really driven by, the needs of, industry, right? The vision of, those communities where we're working, where we're engaging, the buying and the support from government and industries, right? To be able to make that vision a reality, and really kind of structure approach, right? From identifying and aligning on what's the problem that we're going to solve, right? And aligning on the resources that every partner brings to the table, and in a way that it's not necessarily, you know, it's a co-investment, right? That we're all co-investing our time or resources to really solve a particular problem that will have a positive impact, in that part of the world. And again, that part of the world can be here in Arizona, or it can be Latin America, Southeast Asia, different aspects of it. And so I really think we try to look at a lot about kind of building that alignment, right? And being, being open, being transparent, being collaborative to understand, the challenges that we're all facing when we want to come and facilitate this large global partnerships. But at the end of the day, it's really, aligning on like, what, if this can only happen because, those that are part of the table, and what we bring to the table to facilitate that solution. And so, uh, it's hard, but I think the outcome, right, the benefit that we're able to provide, to society, I think really kind of drives forward you know, the early morning calls, the late night calls, right? The multiple iterations on documents and agreements, and well, that doesn't work with us. Well, let's find a way of how we can make it work, and finding those compromises, right? But yeah, I think it's all focused on, trying to, trying to take this role and that we have the assets that are available to us and be able to facilitate it for public good.
I like that word align. I talked with people even within our company, and it's become clear that getting aligned, even in a big company like Siemens, it's not a destination, right? It's a journey, and it's a constant coming back and really, setting expectations, resetting it. Um, I hope we're not an example of the ones that might be hard to work with, but we'll share more in the near future about some of our collaboration. But I guess one, we've worked together for a lot of different years. What share any feedback, I guess, Octavia, what do you think has worked well between some of our collaboration, um, and or just advice for industry wanting to get more engaged with academia? What works well?
Yeah, I know, and you're not one of the hard ones, right? And and I think like as you mentioned, right, we started, we got to know each other. We work with Siemens, being a co-investor in the transformation that we were advancing in working in Southeast Asia, specifically in Vietnam, right? And again, we at ASU, it's been almost, I don't know, 15 years, that we've been part of that journey. And so, we really appreciated Siemens as well as our other industry partners that saw the vision and really wanted to be an active participant, right? And I think we created a great relationship there, right? We saw the opportunity of what, again, the knowledge and the assets that we all had available to us and how they could be part of a larger vision to achieve a specific, transformation and a great outcome itself. And so, so I think it's been great, and it's facilitated a number of other conversations and engagements since then, right? So I think it's definitely, we're super thrilled that you guys think of us as a strong partner, and likewise we do with you all. Um, and I think that the advice that we can, right? I think it's really for us. We know we sort of know that working with ASU, we're a large, organization. We want to try, we try to move fast. We try to match, the pace of speed of our industry partners, right? Trying to understand the pace of change and the space of, conversations can happen with government, with industry partners, right? So, we try to sort of match that change of the conversation, right? And not necessarily hold back the momentum. And so I think it's having, that understanding of the types of partners that work well with your institution, right? I think that's certainly number one, right? I think we sort of, have identified, and we work well with those that are aligned with our mission of access and impact and scale and innovation and learning by failing, right? So I think when we're able to kind of work with institutions like that, which, from our work with you all, we know that Siemens certainly aligns with many of those aspects of it. And so, so I think it's aligning on those foundational components of it. It makes it a lot easier, right? Because then we know that we both agree that, what, it makes sense for us to work on this particular project, learn from it, work through the challenges that naturally any big, partnership has into it, but all understanding that, we're aligned on the reasons why it makes sense for us to work together, on the positive impact that we can have on, the how we're facilitating and how we're moving global engineering education and talent development forward, right? So I think that's probably, one of the things that I would recognize, right? Sort of understand, your own organization, your institution, and really what are sort of the attributes of those, that are shared by partners that you're working with. Because then that creates that foundation, right? So that makes it a lot easier. Sometimes we've entered into projects where that wasn't there, and then, that makes it far more challenging for everybody involved.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of the knowledge and assets, and I think this is a challenge for companies like ourselves, as well as large institutions like yourselves, in areas particularly like AI and microelectronics. How do you ensure that those assets, and that knowledge, and really curriculum design can stay, aligned to rapidly changing workforce needs? Any tips that you can help us all with?
Yeah, I mean, it's so two things, right, that make this a hard question, right, or a hard challenge to tackle, right. One of them, it's the rate of change that happens in this industries, right, and then the complexities of the industries themselves, right. So when you kind of have those two factors to consider, then change and change management and keeping on with pace becomes, really something that we have to think about. And so our approach has been to, really take input signals from a lot of different, sources, right? Or faculty or staff or alumni, right? Through different mechanisms, right? Give us feedback or, close collaboration and dialogue with industry partners, formal and informal mechanisms of that. Our own research and development efforts, right? Where's some new knowledge, new inventions that are being created, and how can we turn that into, a learning experience, learning expertise, industry, reports and industry feedback that we're aware of. And, we try to take all of those signals and really, understand, what's the immediate need, right? Or how does that, where do we need to make changes? Where do we have maybe, knowledge, or a gap in our programming that we can, potentially close? What's midterm, what's long term, right? Sometimes, when we work with organizations, it's, they're really focused on the short term and the midterm. And like all of us, right, that long term's a little bit fussy, right? So we try to like, okay, well, how do we sort of think about this fuzzy world and what can we start doing now to help, your immediate and your immediate needs. And then we're best prepared to start as we get closer to those fuzzy areas and that becomes more clarity. We have mechanisms and models that really help us, you know, change and evolve and meet that need that's now more immediate. Right? So we take all of that signal and really we work with our faculty or instructional designers, right, or partners, right, or technology partners, right, to think about how do we think about existing technologies, new technologies. I think right now everybody's kind of thinking about well the role of immersive technologies in the education and learning space, right? And so how do we also then think about, those areas? But then, how do we also then think about the access component? We're working with new
Mhm.
technologies and, new innovations themselves. And so, we try to triangulate, all of those factors, right? And really built into the process that allows us to move quickly, right? And I think that's certainly one of the areas where like our stackable career measures come into the pictures, right? Because we're able to understand a need, move fast where we have that capability and really kind of be able to have a solution for learners in a shorter amount of time frame that, maybe, more traditional learning experiences would require. So, um, but I think that's something that all of us continue to work with, right? And that's another opportunity of working closely with industry, right? To understand the needs, right? To really ask questions and be curious about their needs, how does it relate to their talent, their skills, new talent that they're acquiring versus their existing talent that they're trying to upskill. And so, I think we're fortunate to really have, a close, engagement with, a lot of industry partners, both large, small, medium enterprises to really, help us navigate, those changes within our curriculum and within our learning experiences themselves.
Great. Well, since you said the magic word immersive, we'll put it in the show notes. I don't want us to spend time talking about it, but we do have an immersive design challenge going on. And I think it speaks to, one way we're trying to bring learners from all over the world to come together and come up with some ideas. It really does drive some, certainly knowledge sharing, but also some assets that we can use kind of after that kind of challenge. So we'll share more on that later. But
Oh, that sounds awesome. Yeah.
one of the topics I wanted to touch on, because it's been coming up more and more in the last, I would say, 2 years, is really the role of learning and employment records, right? It used to be we just kind of had our degree and our paper transcript, if you will, right? And in this day and age, this you mentioned signals several times, right? There's all these signals of the things we learn and our pathways. So can you talk a little bit about how ASU's approaching that learning and employment record integration? What opportunities do you see for those records to really reshape credentialing and even maybe talent mobility?
Yeah. So, I'm gonna we have some amazing colleagues that are working in a group in an organization that's called the Trusted Learner Network, right? And so this is some ASU colleagues, but as well, not just exclusive to ASU. And their goal of the Trusted Learner was to really kind of think about the technology, the governance, as well as the community building, that's going to drive forward verified and digital credentials forward, including, LERs or learning employment records. Right? And so, this team, and a number of us are sort of kind of working with them, right, as academic units to better understand, how, their efforts align with what we're doing. And then obviously, how do we engage with our industry partners? So they're sort of the convening power, right? Thinking a lot about those three areas to remove barriers, right? How do we, improve the mobility of credit experiences and non-credit experiences? In building a new ecosystem where traditional, credentials like courses and certificates and degrees can live with, certifications and verified credentials, again, that we're also building himself. And so, when we're really kind of working on understanding the technology, the governance, right, the community by making sure that we're being inclusive of as many, perspectives as we can to understand, the opportunities and the challenges there, but really focus around, yeah, how do we provide learners, right, with the mechanisms for them to bring all of their learning into one place and really kind of empower them to now be able to tell their own story of their achievements and of their own journey in a way that makes sense for them, right? In a way that they can, have the technology, the tools, the knowledge about the skills that they're able to acquire through those different experiences and convey them to, an employer in one particular industry or a different employer in a different industry, but in a way that allows them to tell their own story of how they're the best candidate for that job, regardless of one industry or the other, right? And so, so I think we're part of the conversation, right? We're trying to understand and how do we move that conversation forward by, creating or looking at some technology, by contributing to kind of those governance models that are associated with this new world. And then also, building that community space. And so, we have, some pilot works kind of going, internally here to again understand how do we, what's the role of technology to really be able to empower our learners to be the best storytellers of their own, learning journey itself. And so, um, we're working on some aspects of it, right? We have some technology tools. We have, working closely with our provost, as many of universities are, to understand how can we, think about traditional credentials, new alternative verified credentials, and then how they can live as in the same space to benefit our students, right? And how they can best connect to a next project, a next opportunity, a next volunteering experience, however that learning can help them achieve, really give them the empowerment to tell their own journey.
I like that. Tell their own journey. Really, it's their own story, right? Of that personalized lifelong learning. I like the word community, right? It's really then how you tell that story and who it maybe resonates with.
Exactly. Yeah, no,
Um,
exactly. So it's exciting, right?
it is. One of the things I guess is, as I know we're going to be coming up on time soon. I wanted us to think about really lifelong learning and what role do you see universities, the institutions really playing in cultivating a lifelong learning mindset? Not just during that macro degree program, but across entire careers.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, for I'm not gonna do a service, right? But I'm gonna do my best, right? But I think President Crow has really kind of brought this vision of we are creating, we're not creating engineers, we're not creating lawyers, we're not creating, marketing graduates, right? We are, creating master learners, right? Really, we are providing, we want our students to build the habits, to build the knowledge, to build the experiences that would allow them to, once they live, they leave from us, right? To be able to have the ability to learn anything that they want, to be able to achieve anything that they want, right? And so, it's something that really kind of resonates for a lot of us, right? So we've kind of created an environment, right, where students can, have a more transdisciplinary learning experiences, right, to really be able to, have an environment where they can safely become those master learners that President Crow often talks about, right? And now they have, a basic foundation of knowledge and experience and expertise that they can build on and go to there, right? So it's something that we talk a lot about when our students are here, right? And I mean, here is part of their, their journey, right? And they to put that into action through a lot of their experiences that they take on. And so I think that's one way of how we hope to achieve that. But also it's looking at our facilities, right? I think ASU has a thriving, and I don't want to call it a retiring community because I don't think that's really kind of doing them any service, right? But it's a thriving community of individuals that are, later in life that are, 18-year-old, freshman students, but they get to participate in this ecosystem, right? They can attend classes, they can mentor students, they can, just participate and facilitate panels, that aspect of it. And so really about living that, and then showing and modeling, right, what lifelong learning really means, right? That it's not just on a fancy presentation deck, but it's something that, that happens and it's weaved into the campus experience. And it goes beyond campus, right? Because the same applies to a lot of our distance learning students too, right? But it's part of just the experience of being at ASU. And so I think it's trying to kind of share those mechanisms, right, of how we can, model and really show what lifelong learning looks like, on a day-to-day practice itself.
I like that, master learners. Yeah, that's the new ML acronym. It's not just machine learning, master learning.
Exactly. There you go. See, we'll have to share it. Yeah.
Um, well, it's almost time to close out, I guess, Octavio. Any other last thoughts on your mind that you'd like to share with our audience about what you and ASU are doing and have done? And
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, really, again, we want to appreciate the invitation, right, to kind of share a little bit of the story that ASU is, building closely with our peers, with our partners, right? So if you're interested in anything that we're doing, certainly let us know, reach out. But also, I want to thank, and recognize and congratulate all the work that Siemens and the global Siemens team is doing to help us move this conversation forward, right? I think as we talked about earlier, right, those partnerships, right, the fact that, it's the work of the many, right, that's going to be required to really understand and bring the value to employers and learners, right, in the area of micro credentials. And so all the work that you guys are advancing, right, through conversations, through your own micro credentials, right, really, again, getting, rolling up the sleeves and jumping into the arena with us, right? I think it's highly commendable. We appreciate that, right? Because I think that really helps, drive the message, right? That it's not just, a university or an academy vision, but it's really a shared vision between, industry and academia. So I just want to say thank you and really appreciate, the work that you're all doing. It's been great to be part of that with you all, right? And I really appreciate, everybody that we've worked with for Siemens has been, an amazing experience to work with. And so, again, just thanks for the effort that you're all doing in the global education space yourself. So
thank you, thank you. I like the rolling up sleeves because I think that is what has changed and why we're all leaning into this now. Is I feel like we have academia and industry coming together to actually do the work together now instead of us just talking to each other of where the gaps are. So, Octavio, thank you. Thanks for joining us and sharing how ASU is redefining education through micro credentials and global partnerships you spoke to and lifelong learning. I've always thought your work really offers an inspiring vision of how innovation innovators in education can empower people all around the world to grow, to adapt, and thrive in this more skilled centered future. So encourage our listeners, check out the show notes for some interesting links. We'll put in there to some of the ASU micro-credential resources and the industry collaborations and Octavio's ongoing insights on extending education beyond borders. And stay tuned for more from our collaboration with ASU. So join us next time on Engineering the Future Workforce as we continue exploring how learning innovation drives workforce transformation.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Engineering the Future Workforce. The show notes include links to any resources mentioned in today's show. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe so you never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.